Thank you, Harry, for the warm introduction and for everyone for hosting me today. Harry's been on our board since January. We both joined the Fed at the same time. Harry has the privilege of being able to say he was not involved in my selection, so any criticism doesn't go to him. But it's great working with Harry at the Fed. These events are fun because it's a chance for us to get out in the community and share a little bit about what we're doing at the Fed. A lot of people don't understand it, and honestly, before I went to Washington, I didn't understand it either. I knew what the Federal Reserve was, but I didn't really understand what they did. And so I thought maybe I'd spend a minute or two just giving that overview, and then I'll turn it to Harry, who will moderate some discussions and respond to some of the questions that you all have put forward. You know, one of the things that's different about our country is that our central bank is distributed. So 100 years ago, in 1913, Congress decided we need a central bank, and they created the Federal Reserve System. But unlike most countries, our central bank is distributed all around the states. So in most countries, the central bank is in the nation's capital, and that's it. Well, 100 years ago, Congress said, we don't want the power concentrated just in Washington, D.C. We want it spread out. So Congress created the Board of Governors, which is in Washington, D.C., and then 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, including the Minneapolis Fed, and we represent what's called the 9th Federal Reserve District. So we represent Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Montana, the UP, Upper Peninsula, Michigan, and part of Wisconsin. And our jobs are to know what's happening here in the local community so that when we go back to Washington, D.C., we're able to bring the local perspective to the national deliberation on monetary policy. So just to be very plain, my job is to represent you. And so getting out in the community and hearing directly from you what's happening in the local economy, what's happening in the job market is very, very important so that I can be informed so that when I go back to Washington, D.C., literally next week for our next interest rate discussion meeting, I'm able to speak and bring your perspective to that discussion. So that's why I'm here. That's why we have a Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis to represent this region. And that's one thing that's different about the United States and our central bank than virtually every other country. So hopefully that helps.
Great, thank you. So most of us know that recently when Neel came into town, he made somewhat of a splash with the too big to fail item. But before we wade into that, I think people in the audience here would really like to hear a little bit about the financial crisis and kind of revisit it and just kind of give us a little history and your thoughts on it.
So I went to Treasury in 2006 before the financial crisis. And I got to tell you, it's obvious now, but none of us saw it coming. You know, when I first went to Washington, I went with the then Treasury Secretary, Henry Paulson. And Secretary Paulson said, our country is due for a financial crisis because markets had been calm and stable for 8 or 10 years. So we looked around. We worked with regulators at the Federal Reserve and at the SEC saying, what could go wrong? What if a big bank runs into trouble? Or what if a hedge fund has some kind of a bad investment? We looked at all these scenarios, but we did not look at a nationwide housing downturn. It seems crazy now, doesn't it? It seems so obvious, but we were looking and we missed it. So the crisis hits us, and at every second we kept thinking, okay, maybe the worst is behind us. Maybe the markets will correct themselves. We don't want to have to turn to Congress. We don't want to have to use taxpayer money to try to stabilize the economy. But the crisis kept getting worse and worse and worse until ultimately, literally, the U.S. economy was on the verge of collapse. Literally, we were looking at a Great Depression type scenario, and that's when we said we have to go to Congress. And that's when, to their great credit, Republicans and Democrats came together, did something deeply unpopular, but absolutely necessary to stabilize the U.S. economy. And so, you know, it was a terrible crisis. It was devastating for the American people. The only good news is that it was only 10% unemployment instead of 25% unemployment, which is what the nation saw during the Great Depression. And obviously, it was very uneven. It was deeply unfair. But that's what we faced. We faced an economic calamity. Fortunately, we were able to pull it off and avoid that terrible outcome.
So I'm going to ask Neel a question, and then we're going to open it up. I think Joe's going to take and kind of be the person to run around the room with the mic if there's a question. And Neel is, if you've read, Neel likes to, so if you have some questions, we really encourage you to ask them, and you'll get an interesting response. So it's 2008. You know, these big financial institutions, Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, AIG, are hemorrhaging and some are failing. Clearly a dire situation. You're working closely with the Secretary Treasurer, trying to stop the bleeding. In your opinion, how close do we come to full collapse?
Well, I'll share with you a couple of the worst moments during the crisis for me. So at the time, I have a mortgage now. I had a mortgage at the time, and what savings I had was sitting in a money market account. And there were a couple moments during the crisis when we were literally on the verge of collapse, and we didn't know if tomorrow the financial system would collapse and all of the money market funds would collapse. And I thought to myself, oh my God, I'm not going to be able to pay my mortgage. You know, what should I do? Should I transfer my money from my money market account to my checking account? I thought to myself, you know, my checking account is more likely to survive than my money market account. Now, I didn't do that because I felt like it was inappropriate for me. I had inside information, so to speak, just how bad the economy was, and it wouldn't have been fair for me to do that when you wouldn't be able to do that. You wouldn't have had that advance warning. So I didn't do that, and I just concluded if the economy collapses and I lose my house, well, millions of other Americans are going to lose their homes too, so I'm going to have a lot of company. But that's how scary it was. That's how close it was. And sitting here today, 8 years later, you know, the economic recovery has been very slow, very frustrating. But I got to tell you, if you had asked us in those worst moments, would we be here today? This is a miracle compared to what we faced at the time. We didn't think, you know, the U.S. Congress authorized $700 billion to bail out the financial system. $700 billion. In the worst moments, we did not think we'd get even $1 back. Now, the truth is, what ended up happening, we got it all back, and the taxpayers actually made a profit. You know, I think $10 or $15 billion is the last I saw. That's a miraculous outcome compared to what we thought it might have been.
Any questions on that experience or things that were going on from the audience? If not, let's not be... Go ahead, Joe. I think there's...
I'm curious why some of the banks that stepped in to buy the assets of these mortgage companies and basically helped create some solvency at that time, why did they get hit with enormous fines years later for something that they themselves did not create when they stepped in to fix the situation?
Well, I think you'd have to look at, and I don't know the specifics, you'd have to look at each case individually. If you look at all the fines that have been paid over the last 8 or 9 years, it's for a lot of different reasons. Everything from some banks engaging in mortgage fraud, to other banks misleading their investors, to other banks violating consumer protection laws. So I don't know the specifics of the specific cases. Hopefully we're getting to a place where a lot of that is now behind us and we can move forward and hopefully have a stronger financial system going forward. But I don't think anybody was completely free of any guilt. You know, you look around the whole country, people ask me, what was the cause of the crisis? At its core, what was the cause? At its core, we all, you and I, participated in a nationwide delusion that home prices only go up. I bought a house in California in 2005. I participated in that delusion. I shared in that. So did other homeowners, so did banks, so did regulators, so did the ratings agencies. And if you look at human history, human societies are prone to mass delusions. Whether it's the tech bubble, remember things like e-toys and all of these tech companies that can just go to the moon? Sometimes we delude ourselves. And so I think there are a lot of people who were at fault that conspired, maybe unknowingly, that led to the bubble. And so there was a lot of guilt to go around.
I appreciate your comments initially about the structure and how the Fed is set up. My question would be, are there districts that are more influential around the country than others? In other words, are they set up to have an equal voice in policy, or they may be set up that way? In fact, does it work that way? If you could address the influence that various districts might have.
Sure. Well, it's set up so that they're roughly equal. The only one that's a little bit of an outlier is New York, so when the Fed decides to adjust monetary policy, we adjust monetary policy through what's called open market operations. So the Fed is buying and selling bonds effectively to adjust interest rates for the national economy. All of that implementation is done at the New York Fed. So the New York Fed has a special role because they regulate Wall Street. And in voting on interest rate decisions, the New York Fed votes at every meeting. The Minneapolis Fed votes every third year. So I'm not a voter this year, but I'm going to be a voter next year on your behalf, and then it'll be 2 more years before I vote. So the other 11 banks are equal. The New York Fed is a little bit different and has a little bit more influence that way. Now, how did these districts get created? So the San Francisco Fed has this huge district, the whole West Coast, with about 60 million people. Our district has less than 10 million people. Well, 100 years ago, these districts were roughly even. Yet the districts were designed 100 years ago, yet the populations have changed over time. So in some sense, we're punching a little bit above our weight because we have relatively low population, yet we're voting on the same cycle as San Francisco, et cetera. And then I think it really just comes down to the individual banks, their president, their researchers, their experts coming up with interesting ideas to challenge the national dialogue on important issues. You should be proud. The Minneapolis Fed, in my humble opinion, before I got here, punches way above its weight. Has really been a force for good on a lot of issues, from too big to fail, going back decades, to early childhood education, to broader economic policy issues. And so I think it's up to the individual banks to make their mark. I certainly want us to have as big an influence as possible, hopefully a positive influence, on policymaking for the country.
Hey, and if we could, I'm going to go off script a little bit. Like I keep telling Neel, you got to come to St. Paul. We've got a wide group of people, elected officials, business people. I think it'd be real helpful for Neel prior to the time to just identify and kind of talk from what part of the community you're from, if you could. And if you don't want to, you don't have to.
Good afternoon. My name's Mary Tingerthal. I proudly live in St. Paul, and I also am the commissioner of the state's Housing Finance Agency. And I want to ask you about how your colleagues on the Fed think about wages and wage growth. And I'm particularly interested in my business. Over the last 15 years, we estimate in Minnesota that the purchasing power on average of people is down by about 12% in inflation-adjusted dollars, while the cost of housing, whether you're buying it or renting it, is up by about 7%. And that gap just keeps getting wider and wider. And there's only so much you can do on the housing side with cost of construction, et cetera. How do we think about addressing the wage growth issue?
Well, so Congress has given us our mandate. We call it a dual mandate, which says we're really trying to achieve 2 things. We're trying to achieve stable prices, so control inflation, and we define that as 2% inflation per year. And then we're trying to achieve maximum employment. That's what Congress has said, Fed, this is your mission. So those 2 things are not always, they don't always work together. So if inflation is climbing, we might have to slow the economy down, which then could hurt employment and could hurt wages. So wages is a very important factor that we do look at. When we think about it, think about the Great Recession. So we had this terrible recession, 10% of Americans were put out of work, much higher percentage in some communities, and wages were stagnant. We've now had a lot of job growth, which is a good thing. So Americans are coming back to work, people are re-entering the labor force, and we're starting to see wages start to climb. And the way it's supposed to work, as the job market gets tighter, employers have to compete for workers. That puts more pressure on wages, and you start to see wages climb. And then as wages climb, you'll start to see prices climb because employers have to pass those costs on to their customers, and that's how you're going to see inflation start to take off. So wages is core into the analysis that we look at, but it by itself is not the target that Congress has given us. Congress has said stable prices and maximum employment, and wages is one way to connect those 2. So if you look right now, the job market keeps creating jobs, which is a good thing. You're starting to see wages come up a little bit, but inflation is still coming up a little bit short. We're not seeing inflationary pressures yet. So we're monitoring it, and this is what's informing the decisions we're going to be making over the next 6 to 12 months.
Tim Mahoney, an old friend of Harry's there.
Actually, Tim and I are classmates in grade school.
So if you want information,
I want information. Well, I'll talk to you afterward.
give you my cell number. two questions, and you can answer either or both. What is the Fed doing to prevent the kind of collapse that we saw a few years back? And then the second question, as Congress has given you the mandate for job growth, we've seen a very uneven recovery, horribly uneven recovery. Does the Fed have a role in that unevenness, or a role in fixing that unevenness? We have communities of color in this particular state that are having real problems. Our greater Minnesota is having some problems, more so than the metro area. It's a very open-ended question. I'll let you take either or both.
Well, both are very important. So first of all, coming out of the financial crisis, a lot of reforms have been put in place to try to prevent a repeat of the same crisis. So banks are forced to hold more capital. There's more liquidity protections around the banks. There's tighter underwriting standards for mortgages. You know, I applied for a mortgage once I accepted my job here. It was an excruciatingly difficult process to get a mortgage. I found I couldn't believe how much documentation they asked me. So on one hand, it's painful. On the other hand, we're trying to prevent a repeat of the same mistakes. Now, in terms of the big banks, I don't think we've gone far enough. I think the biggest banks are still too big to fail. And so we at the Minneapolis Fed have a major initiative. We are developing our own plan to address too big to fail that we're going to release to the public by the end of the year, because I think we should go further. And so we're talking to the best experts in the world to design that plan. So stay tuned. So some progress has been made. I think we've got more to go. In terms of income disparity, you're exactly right. You know, my biggest surprise coming to Minnesota, this is a remarkable state, so much going for it, a diverse economy, beautiful place to live. I was surprised at the income disparity in the state. I just didn't expect it, didn't know about it. And so I think that in some sense, Minnesota is reflective of many other communities around the country that also are suffering from the same income disparities that you talked about. Now, one of the tough things for us at the Federal Reserve is we have the bluntest instrument possible. Like setting interest rates for the whole country, you can't target individual states or individual communities or individual sectors. It's one number for the whole country to balance employment and inflation. But what I think we can do is we have a lot of research expertise that I think we can bring to bear to try to understand these issues better. And then if we can understand them better and identify potential solutions, then maybe other parts of government can step in to take those up and actually fix the problem. I'll give you an example. One of the things about the US economy that's perplexing is that black unemployment is almost always 2 times white unemployment in America. If it's a booming economy and white unemployment is 3%, there's a really good chance black unemployment is going to be 6%. If it's a recession and white unemployment is 7%, there's a good chance black unemployment is going to be 14%. There's a structural factor that makes it almost always 2 times. We don't know exactly why that is. And I'm embarrassed to say we don't know why that is. We need to know why that is if we're going to solve it. I can tell you monetary policy can't close that gap, but if we can understand what the structural factors are, then hopefully we can get other branches of government involved, whether it's regulatory policy or fiscal policy, to make the necessary changes so that everybody in our country has a fair chance to work hard, to get a good job, and to get ahead. And I know we all want that outcome. And so I think we can do our part, and that can be on research, even if we can't solve it by ourselves.
I'm Ted Davis. I have a public relations firm here in St. Paul. About a decade and a half ago, the Minneapolis Fed really moved and changed the conversation on early childhood education through the work of Art Rolnick. And I'm wondering what you're thinking as you either carry that work forward or how you're going to build on that.
Yeah, I think Art Rolnick, it's really inspiring the kind of impact he had and the Minneapolis Fed had, and my colleague Rob Grunwald and others in driving this issue forward. And it's an example of that. That's an example where the Fed we don't have the tools to fix education, but he showed that we have the tools to do rigorous analysis and show people in a non-political, non-partisan way, hey, here's what the analysis shows, and that here's the kind of benefit that one can have. And it actually has translated into real policy in the state of Minnesota and around the country. So I think it's enormously important. I think it's a great example of the kind of impact we can have. And I'm pushing our economists and our staff to look for more opportunities to build on that work, to carry it forward, and other ways to weigh in and make a positive contribution, whether it's within monetary policy or outside of it. In fact, just today, I published on our website and a social media platform called Medium a 5,000-word essay on why the U.S. economic recovery has been so slow. And I talked about, I'll give you an example. I talked about things like immigration. So one of the sources of economic growth is population growth. If you have a growing workforce, you have more workers to produce goods, you have more consumers to buy things, cars, homes, food, etc. Part of our economic growth simply comes from population growth. Well, no surprise to all of you, our population is growing more slowly than it was been growing over the past few decades because the baby boomers are retiring. And so this is happening all around the world, not just here. It's happening in Europe, it's happening in Japan. Well, a big advantage that we've had as a country has been immigration. Because immigrants have wanted to come here, our challenging demographic forces have been offset somewhat by the fact that immigrants have been coming to America. So it's been a strength for us. Well, that can also be part of our strength going forward. Other countries, I'll give you an example, other countries in Europe, some countries, have adopted policies to try to get their fertility rate up through tax incentives, through subsidized child care, through other incentives. Those can be effective, but let me tell you, they're very expensive. So if we want to get our population growth rate up, we can subsidize a lot of this to try to get families to have more kids, and or we can invite immigrants to come in to fill some of the drop-off that we're having because of our lower fertility rate. So my point is, I'm not here to pound the table on one or the other, but if we can do analysis and lay out the facts in a nonpartisan way, I think that that's a good thing to do.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, good to see you. Adam Dunnick, Chair of the Metropolitan Council. My question is about, you talked about this region punching above its weight and some issues that we've taken on in the past. What are some of the issues you'd like to work on and some that we can make an impact here?
Well, I'll say three things we've touched on. Number one is addressing too big to fail. I feel very strongly that we as a country need to do more to address too big to fail, and we need to educate the public about what's been done and what the risks are. And then ultimately the public needs to decide. So we're doing that. Our bank has been a leader at that for decades. We're coming up with our plan by the end of the year, and I think people are going to take it very seriously, number one. Number two, to the gentleman over here, raised the issue of income disparity. This is an area I want us to weigh in on more heavily because it's a big need for the country and because it's in our own community. Right? It's relevant right here. A lot of folks in our community are struggling, and that's not right, and we need to understand that. So I would like us to make a big impact there as well. And then thirdly, just looking at the economic recovery, what are the structural factors that are slowing the recovery? I think that that could be a big contribution, but I'm open-minded. I'm looking for more. Before I even joined the bank, so they announced my job in November, and I met with the research department. We have a team of brilliant economists in our bank. And I met with them and I said, I want you to go off and think about what are the biggest economic challenges we have as a country over the next decade. It could be anything. Think broadly. And then let's get back together and hear your ideas and think about which ones can we make a contribution to. That's how expansively I'm thinking. The bottom line is I want us to have the biggest possible positive impact we can have. I don't have all the ideas. I'm looking to you. I'm looking to the community. I'm looking to my colleagues at the bank. What are your ideas? What are their ideas? And then let's figure out where we can make the biggest impact.
I think we're going to switch it up a little bit, and you'll still have opportunities to ask Neel questions, but there's 3 or 4 questions here that you all had asked that be presented. So much has been reported about the financial crisis. What, if anything, was really missed or unreported that you feel is significant to the history of this economic crisis?
I think the crisis led to deep anger in the country because the crisis was deeply unfair, right? If you bought a house that you could afford and your home value went down and your 401k went down and your savings went down, that was unfair to you. If you bought a house you could afford, but then you lost your job because of the Great Recession and now you couldn't afford your house, that was deeply unfair to you. If it was your taxpayer dollars that went to try to stabilize the system, that was deeply unfair to you. We as a country have this principle that's been passed on for generation to generation. If you take a risk, you bear the reward and the consequences of that risk. We had to violate those beliefs in the crisis to stabilize the crisis. And so that led to great, great anger. And I think it led to the polarization that we're seeing in our society today on both sides of the aisle. Whether it's the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street, they're kind of united in the fact that they're all angry about the crisis. So I understand that anger 100%. But I think the thing that sometimes gets lost is that the people who were there at the Federal Reserve in both the Bush and Obama administrations, in Congress, were doing their very best to do the right thing for the country. And I got to tell you, I'm really proud of the people that I served with, the political appointees, the career staff, who were saying, let's do what's right for the country. If people are going to be mad at us, that's fine. We got to do what's right for the people and what's right for the country. And I think that sometimes that gets lost. And I'm really proud of the people that I was able to work with and be part of.
So this is a good question. Actually, it wasn't in order, but your response. So I think it touches on a tough question. But as a society, we talked about the importance of accountability. There's been many complaints that few, if any, financial leaders who helped create this financial crisis were ever held accountable. Given that no laws were broken, isn't it unrealistic to suggest some type of criminal or civil action be taken against individuals?
Well, I think that, the tough part here is you can't legislate wisdom. So it's not illegal to be stupid, right? People make dumb mistakes all the time. And so it's hard to separate out stupidity from criminality. But it still seems like there are some egregious cases where people were intentionally defrauding investors, intentionally misleading people. And if our criminal, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not at the Justice Department, I'm not an expert in this, but if our criminal laws need to be beefed up so that people are held accountable for willful fraud, then we need to beef up our laws. It does seem like there were people who did commit legitimate fraud and should be held accountable, and for whatever reason they were not able to be prosecuted or were not able to be convicted. Again, you can't legislate wisdom. People are going to be stupid, people are going to make mistakes, myself included, but I do think for the egregious cases, people should have been held accountable.
So let's jump forward 8 years. Economy's moving along, unemployment is low, stock market is hitting an all-time high, yet your message is that we're not out of the weeds yet. There's still a significant risk to the economy. Help us understand what that is.
Well, one of the risks we've touched on is the risk of these large banks. So the biggest banks in America are bigger than they were leading up to the crisis, and they're more concentrated than they were leading up to the crisis. And the tough part is societies forget. Like the crisis is fresh for you and I. We remember it, we just lived through it, we know we're not going to make the same mistake again. But what about your kids? What about your grandkids? The problem is societies tend to forget, and then we repeat the same mistakes. So my concern is that 20 years from now or 30 years from now, whoever's in charge at the time is going to forget how painful this was. Going into the crisis in 2006, the discussion in Washington was not about these risks. The discussion was that our financial system is over-regulated and that we're losing out to other countries. It was just the opposite of what ended up happening. And so my view is we need to build in place stronger reforms and lock them in law so that 20 or 30 years from now, when people have forgotten, our structures are there to protect us, in a sense. Regulators can change rules somewhat more easily than changing a law. So if Congress acts to really make sure to try to address too big to fail, it's going to be much harder 20 or 30 years from now for regulators to relax those regulations when things feel good. And that's when it's most dangerous. When everything feels like it's great, that's when we're most at risk. And so that's the risk that I think about. It's not a risk tomorrow. It's a risk in 10 years or in 20 years that we may repeat the same mistakes.
I want a couple of questions from the audience.
A couple quick ones. Would you tell us when interest rates are going to go up again? And the second one,
No.
would you care to comment on the impact Dodd-Frank has had on the banking industry?
Well, the second question is easier than the first. In terms of interest rates, I was just teasing you when I said no. Again, we have to go back to our dual mandate. The dual mandate says maximum employment and stable prices. So maximum employment means as many people working as possible. The economy continues to create jobs at a pretty healthy clip, about 150,000 a month. Estimates are we need between 80 and 100,000 ballpark to keep up with population growth. So we're creating jobs faster than that. You know, in the depth of the crisis and coming out of the crisis, the big concern among the economics profession was that we would have a lost generation of workers. Workers who left the labor force, who were unemployed for a year or two or more, may never come back in, and they'd be lost. A huge drain on themselves, on their communities, and on society. Well, the good news is, over the past few years, as the job market has gotten stronger, people are re-entering the labor force. That's a really good thing for themselves and for society as a whole. So that process is continuing. That's half of the dual mandate. The other half is inflation. For 4 years, inflation has been coming up under our 2% target. And when you look around the world, Europe's inflation has been coming up low. Japan's inflation has been coming up low. There's something going on in the global economy that is causing inflation to drop all around the world. And so, given that inflation has been coming up low, there has not been any pressure to aggressively raise rates. The view has been, let's keep monetary policy accommodative so we keep putting people back to work, and hopefully we can get inflation back up to 2%. You know, the thing is, we have perfect tools to keep inflation from taking off. If inflation rockets above 2%, we can always raise rates to get it back under control. But when inflation is coming up short and rates are already close to zero, then our hands are closer to being tied. They're not completely tied, but we have fewer tools. And so that's the balance that we're looking at right now. What was the second question? Dodd-Frank, thank you. So Dodd-Frank has done some good. It's forced banks to hold more capital, tighter restrictions around liquidity. The biggest problem that I see is that, in my opinion, it has not solved the too big to fail issue, and yet it has saddled smaller banks that are not systemically risky with a lot of regulations. My view is we need to really deal with the risk posed by the biggest banks, and then we need to relax some of the regulations on the small banks that are not risky so that they can get on with lending in their communities. So I'm not sure that Dodd-Frank got that balance just right. That's part of what we're trying to address with our Too Big to Fail initiative.
Hi there, Patrick Smith, lawyer in town. My question is, first, you have a great website, and in your article, like you announced, is online there, and a lot of other studies that you do. Highly recommend people take a look at it. You did mention why is the recovery taking so long in your article, and you brought up an interesting example in your article today about Google Earth versus the invention of a engine which would make money. Google Earth is free, and we all probably in the room here use it as we're driving. So I don't know where you're fully going with that is my question. My other question is, about 8 years ago, we were at about 8 trillion in debt, the national economy, and today we're roughly 16 trillion, and both presidential candidates are going to spend like crazy, they announced. So as rates go up, wouldn't the service of that debt go up to an enormous number? And then if you could comment a little bit about what's now the Federal Reserve has their own portfolio of long-term bonds and why you're doing that, which seems like you'll never be able to get out of it.
That's it? So let me try to take those one at a time. One of the potential explanations for the slow recovery that some people are offering is mismeasurement, that we're not able to measure economic growth as accurately as we used to be able to. And the reason is, as the gentleman said, for example, Google Maps is an example of an app that I use all the time, but it's free. So how does that get counted in our GDP measurement when it's a product that I use, I benefit from, I value, but it doesn't show up as revenue? Or the fact that healthcare is improving. So there are treatments today that cost the same as they cost 10 years ago, yet they're leading people to live longer lives. How does that show up in GDP? It's confusing, and we don't quite have it right. But is that enough to explain the slow recovery? Is that enough to explain the low investment? Is that enough to explain productivity growth that looks really low? I don't think it is enough, but more work is needed. And so I think it's other factors like people are scarred from the crisis, so they're saving more, they're spending less, they're investing less. The demographic trends that I talked about, the aging workforce and the slower population growth, I think those are likely better explanations than simply mismeasurement, but mismeasurement could be part of it, number one. Remind me your number two.
The debt, national debt.
National debt. So it's true. Our national debt has gone up a lot over the last decade or so. But so far, borrowing costs are at record lows. They're not at record lows because of the Fed. That's what's confusing to a lot of people. If you look all around the world, interest rates have been doing this, falling for 30 years, since around 1980, because of these broader economic factors like demographics, et cetera. So the best analysis right now says that we have plenty of time in the near term to get our debt in order. Over the medium and long term, there's no question we have to get a sustained fiscal path, and that means dealing with entitlement programs, Social Security, and Medicare and Medicaid. Right now, we don't have a debt financing problem. But you're right, as interest rates start to climb back up, the debt service costs are going to be higher and higher for the U.S. government. And that's why it is important that over the medium and long term, we get on a sound fiscal footing, because it is going to be expensive to service all this debt. And then what was number 3? Your own portfolio. Oh, the Fed's own portfolio. So yes, coming out of the crisis, the Fed embarked on something called quantitative easing, where we drove short-term interest rates down to zero, as low as we could. But you think about this, if you're going to buy a house, hopefully you're going to live in that house for 10 years. What the short-term interest rate is not as important to you as what the 10-year interest rate is if you're buying a house. So then once the Fed drove short-term interest rates down, they said, how do we get people to borrow more and invest more? Let's drive long-term interest rates down. So the way the Fed did that was by buying long-term bonds. So 10-year Treasury bonds, mortgage-backed securities, which then drives down long-term rates, again, to encourage you, consumers and businesses, to make long-term investments. So as a result of that, the Fed now has a $3 or $4 trillion balance sheet on its books that at the right time, our plan is to let that roll off and then ultimately wind down the balance sheet once the economy starts moving to a higher growth trajectory. We think we have the tools to manage it, and we're not concerned about it now. Our bigger concern is getting inflation back up to 2%, getting the economy growing at a faster clip. Once we can do that, we believe we have the tools to wind down the balance sheet at the appropriate pace.
Paul Berg with Sunrise Banks.
Where are you? Oh, there you go. Thank you.
First, I'll say, if you're like most from the other side of the river and you need help finding your way out of St. Paul, I'm headed that way after the meeting. So. You mentioned inflation as one of the issues that you consider, at least globally. Are there other global economic considerations that are involved in the decisions at the Fed?
Well, absolutely. So we look at global economic indicators, but that's not the goal. The goal is the U.S. economy. We're working on behalf of the American people to achieve our dual mandate for the U.S. So things like global exchange rates, productivity growth around the world, inflation around the world, the actions of central banks around the world are all inputs into the U.S. economy. So we do pay attention to all of that. But some of the global symptoms that we're looking at are slow economic growth in most advanced economies, so Japan, Europe, the US, very low productivity growth. So think about how productive we are with the adoption of technology. 20, 30 years ago, productivity growth in the US and around the world was growing much more quickly. It's slowed down a lot in the last decade. We don't fully understand why that is, but it hasn't just slowed down here. It's slowed down all around the world. And then these interest rates that have been falling all around the world, and aging societies all around the world. And so we're trying to separate out what are these macro trends that affect the global economy that maybe we have a little less control over, and what are the trends that are unique to the U.S. economy that the U.S. can actually control. And so this is the essay that I published this morning goes into these factors. It looks at what's happening globally, what's happening locally, and then what are the tools the U.S. has to do something about it. Global trends may or may not be in our control. Some of the U.S. trends we might have more influence over.
I'd like to talk about regional balance. So good, we got some over here now. So I was just making some room balance.
My name is Victoria Reinhardt. I chair the Ramsey County Board of Commissioners. And I was curious about something that you said earlier regarding immigration. And a lot of, the political hot potato right now is those that are in this country illegally and the need for immigration reform. And we hear a lot about the anger and the fear and all kinds of other things. But there's a real economic side to this that seems to be lost sometimes, where there are certain communities and areas of the country that, in order to survive economically, they need to figure out a way to make these, the folks that are working there legal. And that's where immigration reform comes in. So I'm just curious about what you think about the economic side of immigration reform.
Sure. So I appreciate you bringing that perspective because, the Fed is religiously non-political, non-partisan. We don't like to weigh into fiscal issues because it's not our bailiwick. But when we're doing what we can with monetary policy and the economy is not growing as fast as the people would like, I think it's appropriate for us to just do rigorous economic analysis and put the facts out there. And then let the politicians make the judgments on how you want to interpret those facts. And so what I tried to do in my paper this morning is talk about the fact that population growth is an important driver of economic growth. You can get population growth two ways: domestic fertility and immigration. And domestic fertility is not growing as fast as it used to be. So you can either adopt three choices. We can accept a lower growth rate, we can somehow try to get fertility up, or you can encourage more immigration. That's math. And so hopefully no one's going to get mad at me for just laying out the math. But that's what the math is, and then ultimately the people need to decide which of those three choices you want: a low growth rate, some way of getting fertility up, or more immigration. Those are the choices.
Hi, my name is Bob Ingracia, and I'm at Minnesota Children's Museum. We're making a major investment in an expansion here in downtown St. Paul. And part of my job is to tell my boss what my best guess is for our attendance and revenue in the next 3 years after this major investment here. And so I've spent last week putting together some scenarios, a high, a middle, and a low, and listed some factors for what would drive a low or kind of a worst case type revenue scenario. And one of the things is a regional or national recession in the next 3 years. And so I'm asking, what should I tell my boss when I get back to the office here today? Are we gonna? Can I wipe that low scenario off the table, or should that one be something we should be thinking about?
I should be asking you because I'm here to get economic insights from what's happening on the ground. If I'm remembering correctly, at any given random year, there's about a 15 or 20% chance that there's going to be a recession in the next 12 months. That's just kind of the normal economics has said that year in, year out. But there's nothing on the horizon that we see looking at the data that says there's a recession about to happen. You just never know. Shocks can come from any number of places. There could be an economic shock if there's some disruption in the oil market and all of a sudden oil prices spike. That could be a disruption. Certainly, I can give you an example. None of us predicted oil going from 150 to 40 or 150 to 30. That's what we call a positive economic shock. It's very painful on the oil patch, but it's good for the rest of the economy because the price to fill up your tank is so much lower than it was a few years ago. And so these things are unfortunately very, very hard to predict. But I can just tell you, when I look at the data, there's nothing jumping out at me saying, oh, there's a recession around the corner. But by their nature, they're hard to predict.
Thank you for being here. My name is Jay Schrader, and I'm a proud St. Paul resident. Turning a little more locally, we hear in our current campaign cycle that's going on for the State House and Senate that there's maybe quite a disparity in policy and that maybe our policies have become too metro-centric and have ignored rural Minnesota. Your job is to take care of the whole region. What's your opinion on how our policy is currently set up as it relates to rural versus metro?
Honest answer, I don't know. I'm still getting to know the district. It's a big district, and I don't know enough to know the impact policies are having. I mean, one of the things we've got going for us in the district is very diverse in terms of industries. So one of the neat things about our region is we've got ag, we've got mining, we've got manufacturing, we've got healthcare, we've got consumer, et cetera. So it's like a microcosm, a little bit, of the whole U.S. economy. And I think you'd have to look at different regions and different industry sectors at the same time. I was up at the Iron Range in March. Actually, Harry helped me set up that visit. The mine workers are struggling, obviously, because ore prices are so low. So I don't know enough yet to know how much that's being driven by public policy versus just geopolitical factors, what's driving iron ore prices down the way they are, and whether or not that balance is there. I mean, if you have specific suggestions or ideas, I'd welcome hearing that. and it'd be an area for me to spend more time getting to know better.
I've got one. So TARP was set up to help stabilize the economy. Looking back, how well did it work? I know you commented a little bit earlier, but looking back on it now, what might have you done differently?
You know, it worked overall much better than we expected it to work. And I don't want to tell you that we were brilliant. Luck is involved too, and maybe some divine intervention. The biggest mistake that I feel like we made during the crisis, but I don't know how to do it better, but it was a real frustration, is that we always had our message muddled. And here's the reason. We wanted to project confidence to the financial markets so that they weren't getting even more scared than they already were. And yet we wanted to level with the American people just how terrified we were, right? And what was on the line. And we couldn't be honest with either. We couldn't tell the markets everything's great, and we couldn't tell the people we're actually scared, terrified. So we ended up with something in the middle. And nobody was satisfied by that. The markets ended up getting a little bit spooked by that. The people got frustrated by that. And it just led to more and more anger. But that's one of the challenges. Like right now, I may have different audiences, but I've got one microphone, and we're trying to come up with an honest, candid message that's trying to achieve our policy objectives. So we always struggle with that, and unfortunately I don't have a better answer, but it was a struggle.
So a few more questions from the audience, and then I've got one more question that I'd like to ask Neel.
Thank you. Excuse me, Dan O'Neill. I'm with the commercial real estate firm CBRE, and you touched on almost touched on this topic, and it's just 2 words or 3 words: negative interest rates. Could you just discuss? I mean, as the Fed, as you guys are either in committee or as you're having a beer with your buddies, I mean, are negative interest rates something real that we should be considering? And what are we learning from the other countries that are experiencing them?
So we always talk about what's called a zero lower bound, which means you can't lower interest rates below zero, nominal rates are zero. Well, actually, you can a little bit. And so some other countries, many countries in Europe and Japan, have lowered interest rates to negative rates. So if you took your money, this doesn't actually happen, but if you took your money and went to the bank would actually pay you to take out a mortgage. Instead of you paying 1% or 2% or 3% of your mortgage, they would actually pay you to take out a mortgage. And the idea is it spurs you to go buy a house, really get out there. So that's the theory, that it encourages more economic activity than zero would. But what we're observing around the rest of the world is it's having some unintended consequences because it's so bizarre, just structurally, it's so bizarre to think the bank is going to pay you to take out a mortgage. It's scaring people. And it may actually, instead of getting people to spend more money, it might be scaring people enough to make them save more and actually have the opposite effect of what the intended intention was of the policy. So this is not something we're actively discussing at the Federal Reserve. I think Chair Yellen, Janet Yellen, the chair of our board, has said, never say never. It's not impossible, but it's highly unlikely that we would go there. And there are other policies we would go to first if we felt we had to stimulate the economy more, just because of these bizarre effects that are hard to predict. If it ends up scaring people instead of giving confidence, that might have the opposite effect of what we want.
Neel, hi. Russ Stark, President of the St. Paul City Council. One of those things for your list of ideas to be looking into. I wondered the degree to which the low, stagnant, or even declining income and wealth in the bottom 60% of the bell curve is contributing to our low economic growth. And I welcome some further thoughts about that from you.
It's an important issue and something that we look at. Step one is we got to get as many Americans back to work as possible. Step two, I agree with the earlier comment. Rising wages, as long as it isn't leading to spiraling inflation, as long as inflation's kept in check, if wages are rising, families will have more money to spend. So they'll buy more cars, they'll buy more homes. It'll be good for all the various sectors of the economy. And so that's something that we obviously look very carefully at. And a lot of research, I think, is being done and more needs to be done to understand income inequality and how that then translates into overall economic performance. I don't think those two things are unrelated. I agree with you. I think they are related, and we need to better understand it. So I appreciate your pointing that out.
So last question here. You wouldn't answer Joe Weiss's question about raising interest rates. So what do you think the economy is going to do over the next 12 to 18 months? And we'll finish up on that.
So our best forecast, my best forecast, is for more moderate economic growth. We're looking around 2% real GDP growth is our ballpark estimate, which is a lot lower than we've been used to, right? It's kind of the, I hate to use the phrase because it's an overused phrase, it's kind of the new normal that we've all gotten accustomed to. I want to get that up, right? I think through other structural reforms we can get that up, whether it's more investment in R&D, better education, so we have a more educated, a more skilled workforce, immigration, as we already talked about. All of these are things that could get that growth rate back up to what we've been used to. And I think that's very important for society. I'll tell you this, tiny changes in long-term growth rate for a country lead to enormous changes in outcomes for the people because of the power of compounding. The difference between a 2% growth rate and a 3% growth rate is huge in terms of what it means for your children and your grandchildren. And so the Fed is doing its part to boost economic growth. We need to get the rest of the government in action to do their parts so we can return to the kind of growth rates that we've been used to.
Great. Well, thank you all for showing up today. Why don't we give Neel a big round of applause?
Thank you.
And Neel, just on behalf of everybody here in St. Paul and the East Metro area, we appreciate you coming over here. This is a great part of the region. It's an important part of the region. And big hats off to the St. Paul Port Authority and BOMA for putting on this event today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.